Hey everybody, welcome to the Benard Associates YouTube channel and welcome to this special video that we're providing on complainant management and investigations. You know, it all starts with a complainant. It's so important in every investigation that we get things right with the complainant and we build on the investigation from there. I mean, when you think about it, you know, everything flows from that, right? If we don't understand the complainant's concerns correctly and we don't build on those concerns, create the right accurate summary of allegations, share that with the respondent appropriately, give them an opportunity to respond, everything starts with the complainant, right? If we get that wrong, then everything else that flows from that is going to be wrong. And so it's really important that we work carefully with complainants. And when I talk about complainant management, I'm not suggesting that this is about trying to manage people in that sort of derogatory way we sometimes hear people say when it's about managing someone. What I mean here is managing our process and managing how we work with complainants to ensure that they feel safe, that they feel like they're part of an investigation, that the investigation is happening with them, not to them, which is something that I think is a common refrain that I've heard from some complainants, where they feel like they weren't really part of the investigation, that it was just they brought forward concerns and then everything sort of was out of their hands from there. And a lot of it is out of their hands. That's the reality. But we have to make them feel like they're a part of it, and that that we care about their involvement. And by the way, we care about witness involvement and we care about respondent involvement too. I'm just starting with complainants, and I'll be doing other presentations to talk about witness management and respondent management as well. Anyway, without further ado, let me move through some of these slides for you and share some of the thoughts that we have and these practical ideas about managing the complainant in the investigations process. So the first thing I want to talk about is why complainant management matters. Really at the end of the day, how you treat the complainant is really going to affect how the investigation is perceived. And if we don't handle complainants properly, it can really undermine their confidence in the investigation. If they don't feel good about the process, if there's no sense of safety, then this can not only lead to them having doubts about the outcome, but it can also lead to problems with the information they share. They might not feel they can share certain bits of information. They might withhold information, knowingly or unknowingly. We really need to work to make complainants comfortable so that we get the best out of them. And in turn, the investigation does the best job it can for them and for everyone else involved. If we don't manage complainants appropriately in terms of making sure that they feel safe, that they feel that it's not a biased investigation, that also leads to potential reputational risk and legal risk. I've had situations where complainants have said, well, I was involved in an investigation once before, and before I could get back to where I was working, everybody knew what I said because they were concerned about confidentiality. Well, that kind of thing shouldn't happen, right? And we can't control what's happened in the past, but we need to put our best foot forward in the present, right? Work with people. Their trust in the process is going to mean everything, and it's going to drive their level of cooperation and in turn the outcomes of the investigation. Now, who are the complainants? Now, this talk is meant to be delivered not just to a certain type of investigator. I'm talking to investigators who do workplace investigations. I'm also talking to people who do regulatory investigations. We will have all different kinds of people that we will be dealing with. It could be an employee or a former employee in a workplace case. It could be a third party like a vendor, a client, even a provider of services to an organization. It could be a member of the public in a regulatory matter, a colleague or employer in a regulatory matter, and also anonymous complainants. And not all complainants are the same. Not all of them have the same motivations. Not all have the same expectations. And so it's important that we engage with them in a way that helps us to understand all of that. Understanding their position, and the context to the complaint is important. It ensures that they're properly informed and that we're properly informed, right? If we don't do that, then we're engaging in a more risky process, and we don't want that. When it comes to anonymous complainants, well, obviously there's going to be a different approach there. We may not even have the opportunity to talk to them. It's going to depend on whether or not we're working with some kind of a portal. We have a company called Complainant that provides third-party anonymous whistleblower platforms. That kind of thing might engage and allow us to go back and forth with a complainant. But the number one thing we have to remember when we're dealing with anonymous complainants is our job is not to figure out who they are. Our job is to figure out what information they can share with us to get them to cooperate so that we can delve into the issues that they're bringing forward. Now, the key objectives of any complainant management is sort of a circular thing. I mean, each thing leads into the next, right? So if you look at this slide, you'll see here that I'm going to start with emotional containment. We're going to have a little bit more on emotion later, but a lot of complainants are emotional, and that's okay. They're allowed to be. It depends on the circumstances and how emotional they're going to be, and maybe a little bit on the person. But we have to try to contain that, and by containing it, I don't mean not allow them to have their emotions. What I mean is, if they're emotional, we need to eventually move past that. We want to make sure that the evidence that we're getting, the information that we're getting from them, is not influenced negatively in some way by emotion. In other words, that they're not sharing information in a way that isn't accurate, because emotion is getting in the way. So that's our job, to really manage all of that. It's not about saying they're not allowed to have emotions, but we have to try and work with them. And we'll talk more about that shortly. Fairness and respect obviously is paramount. People need to feel that the process is fair, and it needs to be fair. And they need to feel respected and treated with dignity. And that's just a given. If we don't do that, then they're never going to feel good about the process, and certainly not about any outcome. Process integrity is very important, making sure that they understand the process, that we've explained it to them, and that we stick with it. That, in other words, we demonstrate integrity in that process so that there's no surprises for them. All of this is helping to mitigate risk, right? We don't want complainants feeling like the process is useless. The process, I've seen it. I've gone into organizations where they've done internal investigations and talked to people where they say, well, we can't trust in these investigations. We can't trust that these investigations were done properly. This can be really a big problem, because if people within an organization already have no faith in the process and the integrity of the process, then it creates a lot of risks, and we don't want that. And all of this leads to information quality, right? In other words, the quality of the information that we get is going to be contingent on us managing all of these other things. Making sure we treat people fair, making sure we're containing the emotions and moving past that, making sure we follow process and there's integrity to it, and we're dealing with all those risks along the way. All of that is critical to accurate and quality information gathering. So when we have first contact with our complainants, we need to do a few things. First, let's acknowledge right up front that this isn't easy, that this is not a fun process to be in, and this is true, again, of respondents and witnesses as well. Nobody wants to be involved in these processes. Even the complainant likely doesn't want to be involved in this. There's a reason they've come forward. We might not agree with them, others might not agree with them, or we might agree with them. None of that matters. At the end of the day, it's a tough process. We have to make sure that they understand that we see that and we treat them accordingly. Part of that is explaining who we are. What's our role? A lot of complainants and others have a real misunderstanding of what an investigator is. They've watched movies, they've watched TV. They might feel that we have powers that we don't, or that we have no power. Like, who knows? Like, there's lots of misconceptions about investigators. So it's really important that we explain our role, that they understand that we're neutral, that they understand that we're not trying to move to a certain outcome, that we want to get to the truth. We want to gather information fairly and independently. These are very important things to explain to make sure they understand the limits of our role. For example, in some cases, investigators are not the ultimate decision makers about certain things. We'll talk a little more about that later, but the idea is to make sure they understand where our role starts and ends. Right? We want to clarify our independence. That in most cases, an investigator is independent. The investigator decides what's relevant. The investigator decides what information is going to be gathered. But that is something that people need to definitely understand in order to feel like the investigator is the key at this particular moment in the process. Now, when we get to the point of decision making, depending on whether it's regulatory, workplace, there are places where the investigator's involvement ends. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Finally, establishing professionalism. You're being watched as an investigator. The complainant is watching you very, very carefully. And we want to make sure that the complainant feels that we are professional, that we can be trusted, right? And we demonstrate that through our actions, through our communication, but we have to establish that professionalism all the way down the line, or complainants just aren't going to feel good about working with us. Managing expectations early. This is something that I think is really important, where I'll talk a little bit more about our decision-making powers. But, people need to understand what an investigation can and cannot do. Not investigator, investigation, right? Investigations have a certain role to play in any situation. And it's important that complainants understand the limitations of an investigation and the limitations of what those outcomes could be following an investigation. First off, there's no guarantee whatsoever of what that outcome is going to be. And they need to understand that that outcome is going to be based on evidence, right? That it's going to be based on getting to the truth, getting the facts, and then making a reasonable decision. That decision may be made in terms of whether allegations are substantiated or not substantiated. That might be a decision that's made by the investigator, for example, in a workplace case. If it's a regulatory case, that's a decision that might not fall to the investigator. In fact, most often it falls to somebody else, a committee or some other individual who's going to review the information gathered by the investigator. Either way, we want to make sure that the complainants understand this, that there's no guarantee of disciplinary action, no promise of disciplinary action. And in fact, investigators don't determine any sort of disciplinary action. Investigators determine whether something occurred or didn't occur. In a workplace investigation, we get the facts and we determine what happened. Then we analyze what happened against a policy, a piece of legislation, to determine whether there were breaches of those things. Then we either substantiate or not substantiate whether or not that breach occurred. So a harassment investigation, we will say the harassment was substantiated or not substantiated. But we then don't go on to say, well, since it was substantiated, this person should receive a 1-week suspension. They should be fired. No, we don't. That's not our role. Our role stops short of that. And it's important that complainants understand that. Another really important area of managing expectations is timelines. I have seen or heard of some ridiculously long investigations. When I hear that an investigation took 12 months to complete, unless there were some really extreme circumstances that limited an investigator's ability to interview critical people or what have you, I don't know how an investigation takes that long. I really don't. We're talking about your garden variety investigation here. I'm sure there's exceptions, of course, but when I hear stories from employers telling me that, well, we've had investigations take 12 months, 14 months, I'm sometimes just at a loss. That being said, investigations aren't going to be conducted in a week or two either, most of the time. So we need to make sure complainants understand, what is realistic in terms of timeline. How quickly will things get done? And keeping them informed about this along the way is something that's very important. Another area to really focus on is confidentiality. What to say and what not to say. Complainants, and others participating in investigation, they need to have information. They need to know certain things. I can't ask a witness to talk to me about something without giving them some context, right? I'm not necessarily going to. I'm not going to expect a respondent to answer to a complainant's allegations without knowing what those allegations are. So everything is on a need-to-know basis. And as an investigator, you're the gatekeeper of that information. So, thinking about what should remain confidential and what can be shared is very important. When it comes to complainants, sometimes I've found, particularly ones that have been traumatized or ones that are incredibly emotional, they may share information they didn't need to share. And, they can't put those words back in their mouth. And they share information, like maybe somebody shares a medical diagnosis that they have that bears zero relevance. They might have shared it because maybe what they're saying is situations like this aggravate my medical condition. But maybe it's a sensitive diagnosis that not everybody should know. Should I, as the investigator, put that into the report? No, I don't think I should. I think it's important for me to make decisions that are in the interest of everybody. I wouldn't withhold information that's necessary for a person to defend themselves. I wouldn't do that. But at the same time, I'm not going to offer information that they don't need to know that doesn't impact their ability to have a fair process. So, there's some decisions that need to be made along the way. And sometimes those decisions need to be carefully thought through. The other issue is protection from reprisal, right? Complainants need to be understanding of that. You need to make it clear to them that they are not to be exposed to retaliation or reprisal. And if they are, that they need to come to you. Nobody is permitted to engage in that kind of behavior, and it's important that we share that with complainants so that they know that the system, and in most cases, reprisal is written in the policies very clearly. So we want to make sure they know that, so that they feel some level of confidence in the process, and they feel some level of protection in the process. And we're not their advocate, but it's okay for us to share information that they ought to know. And I think that's something that's important to make sure they do know, that they do understand that. And I would share that same information with respondents and witnesses as well. So again, there's, I always use this phrase, and I certainly didn't come up with it, but the idea of, to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. Well, to conduct an investigation, you have to share information. You just need to know what information you should share and what you shouldn't. And it's important to really work through that. Building trust without bias. So again, we want to build trust with the individuals that we're dealing with. And particularly, complainants need to feel some level of trust in you as the investigator and in the process. So that all starts with just active listening, just being an engaged listener, hearing what people say. When I see new investigators conduct an interview and the person says something and the investigator goes on to the next question without even delving in a little bit to the thing that person just told them, that tells me the investigator is not listening, that the investigator is basically working through the process step by step by step. I've got my 20 questions I want to ask. I'm going to ask them and get the answers. Well, sometimes the answer you get should lead to other questions. And if it's not, then you're not actively listening and you're not engaged in the right way. So this is a very, very important thing to remember, because if you don't build on the answers you get, you may very well be acting in a biased fashion because you're not expanding on the information that person's sharing with you. Using neutral language is very important. It's important that we try not to use language that, I've had cases where I've been quite frankly horrified by something somebody has said to me, but the language I use in engaging with them as they tell me that remains neutral. I don't want them to feel that I am their advocate, that I am taking their side, that I am horrified by what they've said. Another thing is validating people. It's okay to validate a person's fear, a person's concern about being involved in the process. That's okay. You can validate that and say that's understandable, and you can work with them. But you do not validate the conclusions that they've come to. Somebody shares something with you. Sometimes you'll find when you're dealing with a person, they'll say, well, that's just wrong, isn't it? Don't you agree that that's just wrong? Right? You've got to be careful how you answer a question like that, right? Because you don't want to validate for them or make them feel that you agree with them that something that someone did was wrong. You've got to maintain that level of neutrality. The other thing is documenting objectively. We really need to document carefully. What I mean by objectively is if somebody was to say to me in an interview, you're a jerk, and they raised their voice, they pounded their fist on the table. Well, if I was to write in my notes, the interviewee stated the investigator was a jerk, banged their fist on the table, and left the room abruptly. That's objective. If I was to say the person inappropriately became belligerent with the investigator, making inappropriate comments that were uncalled for, well, I'm embellishing here, but you can see where that starts to become more of a subjective interpretation of what they did rather than an objective documentation of what they did. So always remember to stick to that objective documentation. Now, when we're interviewing a complainant, I believe very, very strongly that we have to let them tell their story. Let them tell us what they can tell us. They can tell it to us in whatever order they want to tell us, but let them have their moment to share how they feel and what has occurred. If you go into an interview with a bunch of questions, you just start hammering them with questions, they are never going to feel like they've had an opportunity to tell their story. That they should be doing way more of the talking in the room than you are, or on video, whichever it is. Definitely you need to do that. Let them tell their story first. Let them have a narrative, and then you can clarify. You can ask clarifying questions, you can clarify facts, you can clarify perceptions. All of that can happen. Make sure you're identifying the evidence clearly and you're identifying potential witnesses, right? And it's okay to ask them about their feelings. In fact, I find asking complainants about their feelings not only makes them feel better about the process, but sometimes that can be a real memory jogger. That when you ask about feelings, feelings are really, really strongly connected to events. And when you get them thinking about how they felt in the moment, they sometimes are better able to share information that is factual. As long as you understand the difference, then there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it at all. Also, you want to control scope creep. So what I mean by that is I started by saying let them tell their story. But if they start to tell their story and go so far outside the boundaries of what it is you're investigating, well, then you've got to find a way to kind of bring them back to the point, right? So you've got to be able to control that as you engage with them. All very important pieces of dealing with complainants effectively. Emotional complainants. I mentioned it earlier. They definitely are going to you're going to come across people like this. It's very common. I think that it's important to really have strong de-escalation techniques in your toolbox. Being able to bring people down from high emotion is very important. Again, when people are extremely emotional, they may say things that they wouldn't otherwise say. They can come across even hostile, which is the next slide I'm going to talk to you about. But we really need to try and bring those emotions down by using the de-escalation techniques that we have, not arguing with them about facts. People want to say something, let them say it. But, sometimes it's just about offering a break. Sometimes it's about, keeping your voice calm, not allowing your voice to rise with their voice. Keeping things grounded is really, really important. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I'm trying to keep this presentation to a relatively short and sweet one. But in some of the courses that we offer, we certainly get into a lot more around de-escalation techniques. In fact, I might be putting a de-escalation video up on YouTube shortly. Now, challenging or hostile complainants, how do we deal with them? Well, we first start by maintaining boundaries, making sure that they understand that there is a boundary around this whole process and the communication we're going to have, and what is acceptable for them to do and what's acceptable for me to do. And I think that we try to do that at the outset. I think that the best way to deal with a hostile complainant is let's try to prevent them from becoming hostile in the first place by setting some clear boundaries at the beginning in terms of how we're going to communicate with each other. Re-anchoring them to the process, remaining very calm, sticking to the facts, sharing with them, and again, maybe offering them a break as well. Sometimes a break is important. An emotional, distraught person needs a break. Maybe a hostile or challenging person needs a break too. That's okay. Again, we have to try and work with these folks, right? We have to try and help them through the process. This should be easy for us. It's not easy for them. It might be, the first time they're involved in something like this, and we really need to work with them and help them. Again, we also want to document though. If the behavior becomes incredibly abusive, obviously we want to document, but what do? We document it objectively, right? Anonymous complaints. Well, they're out there, they happen. And I think that an anonymous complaint can still be a very credible complaint. And it's our job to try and gather as much information as we can. We're going to seek out corroboration, try to find any information that will support what this anonymous complainant has brought forward. If you're using a portal that allows for some communication, then we want to ask some careful questions. And we want to be certain that we're trying to ask questions in a way that are not looking like we're trying to figure out who they are, right? But we definitely need to ask questions and use these portals to our benefit. We've had some amazing investigations that we've done where the complaint has come in anonymously through a portal. We've been able to engage with that person, gather enough information, and in the end, done some pretty darn good investigation work, leading to some very important outcomes that perhaps in certain circumstances would never have come to light, or when they did finally come to light, there would have been a lot more damage done. So, we can't assume that because a complainant is anonymous that they don't want to engage. They want to engage, they're just afraid, right? So we want to keep that work up in terms of trying to corroborate, do the two-way communication where it's possible, but be very careful not to over or underweight the information they provide. We've had anonymous complaints that have just died on the vine almost immediately because we just can't get anywhere with them. And then we've had ones where, as I say, they've resulted in some pretty strong and important outcomes. So it's really important that we not just dismiss this notion of an anonymous complaint. Sometimes they're critically important to deal with. Complainant follow-up during the investigation. So again, I have this phrase. I say there's three kinds of news. There's good news, there's bad news, and there's no news. The worst is no news. When there's no news, it's a opportunity for people to fabricate their own ideas in their head because they want an answer. So their mind is going to come up with one. So I always believe in status updates. If the investigation's been delayed for some reason, that's okay. Better you tell someone that it's been delayed than let them sit back wondering what's going on and coming with all kinds of ideas why things aren't moving forward, right? News is always important. Good or bad, it's important to share it, right? So status updates without, I'm not talking providing details of what people have said, but, we're still trying to interview 2 more witnesses and we're working very diligently. We're going to move forward with that. Reinforcing the non-retaliation. So again, I've had cases where there's been grumblings that people are talking or somebody's been threatened or whatever, very non-specific but concerning sorts of information. Let's reinforce that non-retaliation, non-reprisal expectation with whoever it is. And if it's a complainant, then absolutely with them. We do want to avoid any sort of investigative disclosures. So what I mean by that is, again, making sure any information that we share during the investigation is really meant to be shared in a way that doesn't overshare. In other words, status in terms of where we're at, timelines, that kind of thing is fine, but specific individuals that aren't cooperating or any of those kinds of things would not be appropriate to share. The other thing is there's a whole other piece to this in terms of complainant follow-up, and that is that just because we've spoken to the complainant at the beginning of an investigation doesn't mean it stops there. As we gather additional information, we may find, and we often do, that we need to go back to the complainant and give them an opportunity to speak to additional information that we've gathered, because the decision the decisions made in the investigation could turn on that information, and complainants should fairly have an opportunity to speak to it. That would apply to respondents as well, frankly. But sometimes it's important that we follow up with the complainant. So most of our investigations will start with a complainant interview, respondent interview, witness interviews, and then quite often going back to the complainant and the respondent and giving them the opportunity to speak to information we gathered as part of the investigation so that they have that final word, right? That's very, very important. Closing the loop. So when the investigation is finished, obviously we want to advise the parties of what's happened, and That's going to start with basically informing them that the investigation is concluded and sharing what's appropriate. Now, depending on your jurisdiction, depending on the nature of the investigation, if it's a regulatory investigation, then a proper decision will be issued. So informing the party that the investigation is concluded is one thing. Sharing with them what the outcome was, well, there may be a formal process for how that happens, whether it be a written decision that's issued. If it's a workplace investigation, well, that might be a combination of a verbal and written sharing of what the decision was. Depending on where you are, what your jurisdiction is, there are certain things you're allowed to share and certain things you aren't. So it's really appropriate to understand what it is you can share, right? And then in doing all of this, there should be, where possible, some sort of support resources. And I should have mentioned earlier that really support people are very important in most investigations. When you're dealing with a complainant, particularly if they're, again, somebody who's maybe dealing with a very traumatic situation, but it could be anybody who's complaining, give them the opportunity to have a support person present during their interview. Let them engage with that support person and have that support person present. Sure, there's rules around who that person can be and what their role is, but support people can really go a long way, particularly if we go back to the emotional complainant. Having that support person there can do a lot to help to manage that emotional situation, whether it prevents it or whether it's a great resource in the moment to help address an overly emotional complainant. So, really, really important that we think about that, not only at that point, but again, some support resources for the complainant when we're sharing with them, the outcome of an investigation. Now, sometimes complainants are going to be dissatisfied, and that is what it is. I actually had a call a couple of months ago from a complainant who said to me, one of your investigators conducted this investigation, and I wasn't happy, not happy at all with the outcome of that investigation. And I was expecting the next sentence to be, some sort of verbal reprimand but what shocked me was the person said, but you know what? I understand how they came to that conclusion. And I just wanted to let you know that despite the fact that I'm not happy with the outcome, I feel I was treated fairly. I feel like the process was fair, and I appreciate all the work that your investigator engaged in. And I almost fell off my chair. It was not common to get a call like that, but it certainly spoke volumes about the quality of how that investigator treated that individual and how they worked with that individual through the process. So just a little story to emphasize that even though complainants might be dissatisfied with the outcome, what we're hoping is that they're not dissatisfied with the process. Now, there's lots of common reasons why they might be dissatisfied. There's not much we can do about that. They might not, there are some people that will never be happy. In fact, I actually had a case one time where somebody, there was an appeals process, and while the investigation went that person's way, they appealed it. Now, the appeal was tossed out as being frivolous and vexatious, but what was interesting was they appealed it because remember when I said how we have to avoid scope creep and we have to keep the person on track? Well, I was trying very hard to balance the person's ability to share their story with not sitting in a room with them for 8 hours, when we only needed 1 hour to get to the stuff that we needed to talk about. And so as a result, they were upset in the end because they didn't feel that they got to share their story. None of us are perfect. I tried to find that balance. In the end, we got to the right conclusion. We tried very hard to give that person plenty of latitude to speak. But once it got to a certain point, there's limits, right? There's a point where we have to cut that off. So, people can be dissatisfied for any number of reasons, even when the case goes their way. One thing we can't do is renegotiate the outcome. We can explain the process to them again so that they understand that if they need that. And we can give them their options for possible appeals if that's what they feel they have to do. But that's pretty much as far as we can go when it comes to that. And a lot of times, especially for us as external investigators, we don't deal with this. This is something that's often left to others, either within the regulatory body or within the employers, like human resources or what have you, to have to deal with. But these are challenging situations. Some of the common mistakes to avoid. Again, oversharing information. We only need to share what needs to be shared. We only need to share the information that people have to be able to provide us with reasonable information and nothing more. So again, it's balancing confidentiality with giving people enough information so that we can move the investigation forward and make reasonable conclusions from that information. Overpromising. Don't overpromise how quickly the case can be completed. Don't overpromise anything. In fact, you shouldn't really be promising under, even, or over. Don't promise people things. The only thing you're responsible for is, treating people with respect, managing the process in an expeditious manner, and attempting very hard to do the very best you can without making promises to people. If there's one promise I'm going to keep is if I tell you I'm going to show up to an interview at 1 o'clock, I'm going to be there probably a few minutes before that. That's the kind of promise that we want to make and we want to keep, because that helps to instill trust. So we are promising things like that. But in terms of outcome, in terms of timelines, no, we've got to be avoiding that kind of thing, because it really can just get us into hot water. We never want to appear aligned with the complainant. Again, you can definitely share your understanding of how upset they are in a particular moment, how difficult the process is, but we cannot ever come across like we're aligned with the complainant's perspective on things. And that's why we've got to be very careful in how we answer some of those challenging questions that might come our way. And again, we want to avoid ignoring the emotional impact. The emotional impact of a situation that someone's dealing with, having to be involved in one of these processes, is something that we really need to take note of, because if we can't deal with that, then it's very difficult to get to the place in the investigation that we're going to gather that most useful information. Practical framework, the 5 C's. So caring, clarity, consistency, control, and closure. So caring is empathy without bias, right? Clarity is knowing our role, knowing our limits. Consistency, messaging, and following up, right? How we communicate, what we say, following up with people, sharing the right amount of information. Control is scope and documentation. Documenting objectively and making sure that we're staying within scope in our investigations. And closure, make sure it's clean, make sure it's defensible. So the key takeaways with this investigation, the key takeaways with this talk really are, complainant management is one thing, complainant advocacy is another. I'm not promoting advocacy for complainants. I'm promoting managing their needs, managing their understanding, treating them with respect, and helping them through the process. But that doesn't mean we are their advocate. That doesn't mean we're taking their side. Very important distinction. Process, discipline is protection. What do I mean by that? Stick to your process. You have a process, follow it. Follow that process, because that process will be your protection, that you're following things the way they're meant to be followed. You're doing things the way they're meant to be done, and that's critical. Communication drives trust. The more you communicate, I'm not saying it has to be daily, but keeping people in the loop, communicating openly, communicating with respect, being an active listener, all of this will drive trust. Trust helps you get the best information for your investigation, and it also ensures that people feel good about the outcome at the end. At least you hope they will, if they trusted in that process and trusted in you. And documentation is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical that we document objectively, often, and in a manner that is going to be useful to us when, if 18 months later in a courtroom or an arbitration hearing or a discipline hearing, we have to remember what was said or what was done or the sequence of events. So documenting is very, very critical. So with that, I want to thank you. Again, this is just the first of a series of videos we're going to put on YouTube. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. And hey, consider subscribing to us if you haven't already. we've got about 850 subscribers, I think, maybe a little more, might be pushing 900 subscribers. And, we do this just to share information. We're not getting paid for this. We just want to be part of the solution. And we see that as, the more we can share information that's helpful to you, the better. So please subscribe and feel free to reach out anytime. You can get all of our information off of YouTube. You can go to our website. You can reach out to me and find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks very much for your time. Thanks very much for your attention, and all the best. Take care.